Brookridge Summit, the fire that lit a revolution. It was a Friday evening when everything went dark. I remember the exact moment because I was standing in my garage halfway through tightening a bolt on my lawnmower engine. The wrench slipped in my hand just as the overhead fluorescent lights flickered and died. At first, I thought it was a break or something local. But when I stepped out onto the driveway, I saw neighbors emerging too. Flashlight beams darting porch lights all out street lights cold. The entire block had gone dark, and not just for a minute. Something was off. My name is Tom Granger. I'm a retired fire marshal, 62 years old, divorced, and a proud grandfather of 3. After 30 years in fire service, I thought retirement would be simple mowing lawns, watching Braves games, and fixing anything that dared to break on my property. I never imagined I'd be dealing with this a neighborhood blackout not caused by a storm or accident, but by the very people who were supposed to protect us, the HOA. I live in Brookridge Summit, a quiet tree-lined community that looks peaceful enough on the surface. But peace in Brookridge is maintained through rules, fines, and the iron grip of a board that believes they own our lives, and lately they'd become bolder. We'd all felt it. More fines for aesthetic violations, passive-aggressive newsletters, sudden board meetings nobody could attend. But this blackout felt different. It was deliberate, calculated, and frightening. I walked down the sidewalk with a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. The cell signal was patchy ironic, considering the HOA had recently opposed a cell tower proposal because it would ruin the skyline. A group of us gathered in front of the Simons house at a Navy vet with a gruff voice. Maria, who ran the neighborhood daycare, and Ellie, who took care of her bedridden mother in the house across from mine. "Your lights out too?" Maria asked, cradling a shivering toddler against her shoulder. "Yeah," I nodded. "Whole street's dead." "I called Georgia Power," Ed grumbled. "They say there's no outage reported in our area. Grid's operational." We all looked at each other, then back toward the darkened homes, the eerie silence broken only by a dog barking in the distance. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, the kind of stillness you learn to fear when you've seen enough emergencies. That night, I slept with a battery-powered lantern beside my bed and a fire extinguisher near the door. Old habits die hard. I kept waking up every hour checking the temperature. It had dropped to the low 40s. Ellie's mother needed electric heating for her arthritis. Maria's baby monitor wouldn't work without Wi-Fi. I imagined how quickly things could spiral. By morning, we still had no power. And no explanation. The HOA hadn't sent a warning. No emails. No notices on the community board. Not even a flyer slipped under the door. And this was the same HOA that once fined me $50 for leaving my garbage can visible for 8 hours after collection. I decided to pay a visit to the HOA office, a tan stucco building near the clubhouse. I didn't expect anyone would be there on a Saturday, but to my surprise, the lights were on inside, powered by a backup generator, of course. Janice Langston, our HOA president, was sitting behind the desk, sipping a latte like nothing had happened. She raised an eyebrow when I entered. "Tom," she said flatly. "To what do I owe the visit? I'm here about the power, Janice," I replied, voice calm but clipped. "The whole block's out. Georgia Power says there's no issue. So what happened?" She looked up slowly as if deciding whether I deserved the truth. Then, like a queen granting a peasant mercy, she leaned back in her chair and said, "The board voted to cut temporary power to delinquent properties until assessments are paid. It's not permanent. Just a reminder." I blinked. "You're telling me you shut off utilities to families without notice? In winter, let's not exaggerate," she replied coolly. "It's not families, it's 6 properties, all behind on their HOA dues. Yours included, I believe. I missed one payment," I said, jaw tightening, "by 3 days, and I called to explain." Janice waved a manicured hand. "It's a policy decision. We're within our rights." "No," I said slowly. "You're not." She gave me a thin smile. "Well, if you feel otherwise, you're free to take it up with the board at the next hearing. Now, if you'll excuse me." I left without another word because there was no point arguing with someone who thought empathy was a weakness. But inside something had shifted. A fuse had been lit. Because Janice didn't just cut off our power, she severed something much deeper. Our trust. That day I walked door to door checking on neighbors. Ellie was struggling. Her mother had started coughing overnight, and the backup battery for her oxygen assist was nearly dead. Maria had driven her toddlers to her sister's place. Ed Ever the Stoic was sitting on his porch in a coat, sharpening a hatchet like it was 1850. "This is abuse," Ellie whispered, voice shaking, as I helped set up a propane heater in her living room. "It's like they think they're landlords. They're not, I told her. But they think they are, because we let them act like it." As the sun set again over dark rooftops and chilled living rooms, I stood on my porch and looked at the black void that used to be my street. Not even the stars felt friendly that night. And then in the distance, I saw something flicker, a small glow orange, and sharp against the blue-black dark. At first I thought it was a candle. Then I saw the smoke. My stomach dropped. It was a fire. And the house it came from was Eleanor James's. The widow in her 80s, lived alone, used oxygen tanks, no smoke detectors because her power had been cut. And just like that, the darkness turned deadly. By the time I reached Eleanor's house, the air was already thick with smoke. I was barefoot, running down the cold asphalt, flashlight forgotten somewhere behind me. My mind had entered a mode I hadn't visited in years, not since my fire marshal days, where every second slowed down and sharpened into instinct. The flicker I saw from my porch was now a full-blown blaze licking up the back of her vinyl-sided home. Her porch lights were out of course. The power was still dead. I shouted her name as I reached the side yard and tried the back gate. It stuck. Swollen from the moisture, or maybe warped from the heat, I couldn't get it open. I kicked it, once, twice. On the third try, it burst inward, and I ran straight through the overgrown path to the back of the house. The kitchen window glowed with fire. Not an electrical fire, this was open flame feeding off something flammable near the stove or counters. Inside, I saw Eleanor's silhouette hunched, confused, moving slow. I didn't think, I just acted. I ripped the screen door open and pounded against the glass. "Eleanor, it's Tom," opened the door. But she didn't. She couldn't hear me. I pulled my flannel shirt up over my mouth, backed up 3 steps, and threw my shoulder into the door. I felt it crack, but not give. One more time, I told myself. I braced again and slammed into it. The lock broke. The heat hit me like a punch to the chest. Not unbearable yet, but enough to make every breath feel coated in ash. I dropped to a crouch and went in, crawling low under the smoke. "Eleanor," I shouted again. This time she turned. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, as though unsure if I was real. She had her walker but wasn't using it, just standing there, trying to decide what to do. "I've got you," I said as I reached her. She shook her head. "My oxygen. I can't. I didn't wait." I looped one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her. She was frail, lighter than I expected, all bone and fear. I rushed back through the hallway, careful not to knock her head against the smoke-filled corners. As we burst through the front door, I felt the fire surge behind us, something collapsing in the kitchen. By the time I reached the street, people were gathering. Ellie, Maria, Ed. Someone had called 911, but I didn't hear sirens yet. I laid Eleanor down on the lawn, covering her with my own jacket, checking her breathing. Her chest rose and fell shallow, but steady. She coughed, then blinked up at me. "You came back," she rasped. "Always," I said, and I meant it. The fire trucks arrived 8 minutes later. Too late to save the back half of the house, but early enough to stop the blaze from spreading. The fire marshal, a guy named Rourke, I used to train, nodded grimly at me when he saw the damage. "She's lucky you were there," he muttered. "She's lucky I wasn't asleep," I said. But the moment of relief didn't last long. As the firefighters rolled hoses and the EMTs tended to Eleanor, a white Lexus pulled up across the street. Out stepped Janice Langston, the HOA president, her heels too high for the lawn, her expression a forced mask of concern. "What happened?" she asked, scanning the crowd. "You happened," I snapped before I could stop myself. She blinked. "Excuse me," I stepped closer. "You shut off the power to this block." Eleanor's smoke alarms didn't work. Her oxygen machine failed. She nearly died in there. Her gaze flicked toward the charred house. For the first time, a crack of uncertainty crossed her face. "We followed protocol." "No, Janice," I said. "You created a hazard. You endangered lives." More neighbors gathered now. They'd seen the smoke, the flames, but they also heard every word we exchanged. One by one, people turned toward us, quiet but watching. It was like someone had finally put a spotlight on the truth we'd all tried to ignore. Janice adjusted her scarf. "We'll launch an internal review, don't bother," I interrupted. "The city's going to investigate now." She stiffened. "There's no need for overreaction. You shut off life-saving systems," I said, my voice low but burning. "That's not an overreaction. That's a lawsuit." She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. Rourke approached us then, clipboard in hand. "We'll need a report on why the alarms didn't trigger," he said, glancing from me to Janice. "Preliminary cause looks like a grease fire, but the bigger concern is the absence of emergency response systems. No power means no detectors, no fans, no alert systems. That's a big deal." Janice paled. "I'll email your office," Rourke added. She tried to nod professionally, but the tension in her jaw was unmistakable. She looked like a woman cornered. Later that night, I sat on my porch staring at the smoldering silhouette of Eleanor's home. She was at the hospital for observation, but stable. I kept thinking about the way her skin had felt in my arms. Hot, fragile breathing, shallow. I hadn't felt that kind of helpless fury in years. Not since the day I lost my kid brother to a fire no one saw coming. That was the moment it truly sank in. This wasn't just about dues or broken bylaws. This was negligence, abuse of power. And no one else was going to fight it if we didn't. Ellie sat beside me on the steps. She hadn't spoken much since it all happened, but she looked at me now, her eyes hollow but burning. "They don't deserve to lead us," she whispered. "No," I said. "But they've gotten away with it because nobody's stopped them." I stood then. My knees ached. My back cracked like dry wood, but my purpose was sharper than ever. This ends now. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was ready. The next morning, the neighborhood felt like it had been through a storm. The smell of burned wood still hung in the air, mingling with that strange, acrid scent of melted plastic and charred insulation. Yellow caution tape flapped gently in the breeze around what was left of Eleanor's back porch. Her windows were blackened with soot. People walked past, slowly whispering, lingering longer than usual, not out of morbid curiosity, but because we all knew what had nearly happened. What could have happened to any of us. By 9 a.m., Janice had called an emergency board meeting, posted hastily on the community bulletin and HOA Facebook group. No time, no location, no Zoom link, just meeting at HOA. Clubhouse, 10 a.m. sharp. Attendance encouraged. It was a trap, a performance. But I showed up anyway. I wasn't surprised to find folding chairs already set in neat rows inside the clubhouse. It looked more like a wedding venue than a place for neighborly governance. Faux wood floors, ambient music, a tray of scones and paper cups of bitter coffee on a plastic table in the back. Janice stood at the front dressed in a crisp red blazer, flanked by the other board members, Michael Tien, their legal advisor who never actually passed the bar, and Linda Cartwright, who cared more about weed height than civil liberty. The room filled up fast. Maria arrived with 2 kids in tow. Ed leaned against the wall with arms crossed. Ellie came late, sitting near the back with her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs. Janice began with her usual overly enunciated tone. "Thank you, residents, for attending on such short notice. We understand there has been concern after last night's unfortunate incident." "Unfortunate," I said loudly. "A woman nearly died. A few people clapped. Others murmured in agreement." Janice's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Mr. Granger. And we're all very relieved that she's recovering. But let's remember the purpose of today's meeting to clarify the policy surrounding utility interruptions due to non-payment of HOA assessments." She clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation appeared on a screen behind her. I had to stop myself from laughing. "Slide 1, she said, gesturing. "As per our revised CC&R dated March of last year, the HOA reserves the right to suspend services and amenities for delinquent properties. This includes, but is not limited to, access to pools, fitness centers, trash pickup, and," she paused for effect, "certain shared infrastructure." "What the hell does that mean?" Ed barked. "You're calling power a shared amenity." Michael Tien stepped forward. "The HOA controls the private transformer boxes for interior blocks. The utility company delivers to our master meters, and we manage the distribution. That's legal under the joint service model the community voted for in 2018 voted. Ellie said quietly. We never voted. You mailed out a survey and called the silence a consensus. That is considered sufficient under the statute, Michael replied smug. Maria stood up. You shut off power to families with babies and elderly folks. You endangered lives. Janice held up a hand, the way a kindergarten teacher might try to control a noisy classroom. We understand emotions are high, but enforcement of dues is essential to maintaining our community standards. It's not personal. You cut off smoke detectors, I said, stepping forward. You silenced life-saving equipment, and you didn't give us notice. Not even a warning. There was a silence. Then Janice said the sentence that would echo through our neighborhood for months. Well, she sniffed perhaps if residents prioritized their dues over unnecessary luxuries, situations like this could be avoided. The room erupted. Chairs scraped, voices shouted. Someone yelled, You think oxygen tanks are a luxury? Maria was sobbing now, trying to comfort her daughter while keeping her voice steady. You endangered my kids. Others were standing shouting over each other, pushing forward. For a moment, I thought someone might throw something, but I stepped in front of them and raised my voice over the din. Enough! They quieted. This isn't about dues, I said. This is about power, not electric power. Control. This board thinks it can scare us into obedience by threatening our safety. That ends now. Janice looked flustered. Are you threatening legal action, Mr. Granger? I'm promising it. And with that, I walked out. Half the room followed. Later that day, I went home and retrieved the folder I hadn't opened in years. A heavy black binder labeled Emergency Compliance. Inside were the documents from my fire marshal days, municipal code excerpts, emergency utility standards, life safety protocols. Most people would have tossed this stuff after retirement, but not me. My brother died in a fire when we were teenagers. His name was Matthew. He was 10. I was 13. We shared a bedroom with bunk beds and a poster of the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team above the dresser. He was the funny one, always collecting bottle caps and building towers out of Lincoln logs. The fire started in the basement, faulty wiring, they said. My parents were asleep upstairs. The smoke rose fast. The difference between life and death came down to a single battery. The smoke detector had none. That sound, or the lack of it, stayed with me. The stillness, the way my mother screamed when she realized he wasn't behind her. How my father had to be pulled out by the firemen because he wouldn't stop trying to go back in. I'd been away that night camping with my scout troop, roasting marshmallows while my brother choked on smoke. That guilt, it never left. Even after years of therapy. Even after decades of saving other lives as a fire marshal. Some wounds just stay open, quietly. And now, here I was again. Watching a neighborhood act like nothing had happened, like Eleanor's fire wasn't a warning from the past, screaming into our present. This fight wasn't just about Eleanor anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about what happened when we allowed power. Real electrical power to become a weapon. When people like Janice saw utility control not as a responsibility, but as leverage. And I couldn't let it go. I pulled out the manila folder I kept in the garage safe, the one marked Matthew. Inside were the original fire reports, the photos, the autopsy summary yellowed with time. I didn't need to read them again. I just needed to feel their weight, to remember why I swore to never let someone die because I didn't speak up. It was nearly midnight when my phone buzzed. A message from Sandra Williams, a local investigative reporter I'd helped once during a commercial code scandal in the 90s. She'd caught wind of the fire and my outburst at the meeting. Someone had posted the whole thing online. The video was going viral. I want to cover it, she said. This has broader implications. Abuse of HOA power, private utility management, elder endangerment. It's a story. Good, I told her. Because people need to know. This can't keep happening. As I hung up, I looked out over the neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, lights were slowly flickering back on. The HOA, under pressure, had restored power not out of remorse, but fear. They could feel the tide turning. So could I. But I knew better than to celebrate too early. This was only the beginning. 2 days after the fire, Eleanor was discharged from the hospital and brought to stay with her niece in the next county. Her house, though still standing, was uninhabitable. The siding had melted. The kitchen was gutted. Her bedroom closest to the source of the flames was blackened with smoke damage and waterlogged from the hoses. And through it all, the HOA remained silent. Not a statement, not a letter, not even a call to Eleanor's family. But something else happened. Something changed in us. It was subtle at first, neighbors pausing longer when passing, ascending the throne of the neighborhood. We weren't just witnesses. We were evidence. The courtroom itself was small, barely large enough to hold 20 people, but the clerk had moved in extra chairs to accommodate the media. Carla Nunez stood at the front table with the poise of a woman who knew she was holding a royal flush. Across from her sat Michael Tyen, the HOA's legal mouthpiece, already sweating through his collar before the judge even walked in. Judge Lansing, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a gravel voice, entered without fanfare and called the session to order. Carla began with precision. "Your Honor," she said, placing a stack of printed emails onto the table representing evidence of intentional utility disruption by a homeowners association carried out without notice, in direct violation of both Georgia Municipal Code and the neighborhood's own governing charter. As a result of this reckless decision, a residential home was damaged by fire, and an elderly woman nearly died. She turned to gesture toward us. Our witnesses include residents affected by the outage, including a former fire marshal with decades of public safety experience. Michael tried to recover with a textbook opening, obscure legal references, citations from documents nobody cared about, and a pitiful argument about internal governance rights. Judge Lansing cut him off after 15 minutes. "Mr. Tyen, am I understanding correctly that the HOA admits it shut off electrical access to homes?" "Yes, but only to delinquent." She held up a hand. "That's not what I asked." "Did you cut electricity to occupied residents?" Michael paused. "Yes, and were residents notified ahead of time?" "There was a policy clause, page 14 subsection. Were they notified?" "No, not directly." She exhaled. "Proceed, Ms. Nunez." What followed was the most surreal 2 hours of my life. One by one, we were called up to testify. Ellie described the fear of watching her mother's oxygen tank run out. Maria explained how her baby developed a fever that night from the cold. I stood and recounted the night of the fire, the kitchen engulfed, Eleanor's face in the smoke, the way the alarms had stayed silent. Then Carla dropped the bomb, the internal emails. The HOA board, Your Honor, referred to their blackout strategy as a pressure tactic to force payment compliance. They spoke of targeting the most vocal households. They even debated how best to time power cuts for emotional leverage. The courtroom was still as she read those phrases aloud. When it was over, Judge Lansing ordered a temporary restraining order, effective immediately, blocking the HOA from suspending utilities, assessing punitive fines, or retaliating in any form. A full investigation would follow, and criminal charges were not off the table. But the war wasn't won yet, because as we walked out of court, Carla leaned close and whispered, "They're going to fight back. Hard. Expect dirty tactics." She was right. Within 48 hours, 3 of us received anonymous letters in our mailboxes. No return address. Just threatening lines like, "Watch your step," and "Power can go out for anyone." It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't smart, because Ed had installed a camera on his mailbox the week before. The footage showed Linda Cartwright, the HOA's enforcer, walking up at dusk with a hood pulled low, slipping the letters into our bosses one by one. When we showed the video to Sandra, she aired it with the headline, "HOA official caught intimidating residents." By morning, Linda had resigned for personal reasons. Then came the audit. The city, spurred by pressure from the court and public outcry, launched a full inquiry into Brookridge Summit's HOA finances and operating procedures. What they found was damning misallocated funds, unauthorized spending on board member home repairs, and nearly $90,000 listed under legal contingencies that no one could explain. Janice's emails again told the story. One line stuck with me: "It's easier to control compliance when residents are too overwhelmed to fight." That became our rallying cry. We printed it on shirts. We used it in signs. We made it our signature hashtag. Overwhelmed no more. The movement took on a life of its own. Other neighborhoods reached out sharing stories of similar abuses. Lights shut off homes fined into foreclosure families, forced to move. We realized this wasn't just a Brookridge problem. It was systemic, and the more we spoke out, the more the pressure mounted. Janice, for all her smug composure, began to crack. She stopped attending meetings. Her name vanished from newsletters. Rumors flew that she'd retained a private attorney, that she was being investigated for embezzlement, that she planned to resign and leave town altogether. 1 week later, we received official notice. Janice Langston had stepped down as HOA president, effective immediately. No explanation given. The HOA board scrambled to maintain control. They tried to appoint a replacement, someone loyal, someone quiet, but by then we had enough votes, enough signatures, enough momentum. We called for a special election, and this time we had candidates who weren't playing games. Maria ran for treasurer, Ed for compliance officer, Ellie for communications chair, and me, I was nominated against my own protests to run for HOA president. I stood in front of my neighbors on the night of the vote, unsure if I even wanted the title. But then I looked around and saw what we'd built. Not just resistance community, real connection, courage, people showing up for each other not out of fear but hope. I cleared my throat and said I didn't set out to lead. I just wanted to protect my home. But if protecting it means standing up, speaking out, and never letting another Eleanor happen again, then I'll do it, with everything I've got. They voted that night, and I won. Unanimously. I didn't sleep the night I was elected HOA president. Not because of excitement, but because of the magnitude. I'd spent months fighting against this position of power, and now it was mine. It felt like being handed the keys to a machine that had already done damage, and now expecting me to both steer and rebuild it at the same time. But I accepted not because I wanted control, I wanted repair, redemption, reform. And because deep down, I knew the job wasn't done. By morning, I had 6 voicemails, 2 from reporters, 1 from a law professor at the state university asking if he could audit our case study, the rest from residents, some thanking me, some warning me. Tom, one message said, I just got a letter from the city's building and zoning office. They're investigating every permit the HOA's issued for the past 5 years. Is that real? Yes, it was real. And it was long overdue. Thanks to Carla's filings and Sandra's media attention, the city had launched a formal inquiry into Brookridge Summit's HOA. Not just the blackout, everything. Every fine, every lien, every contract, every modification made under Janice's reign. What began as a fire investigation had blossomed into a full-scale audit, one that sent shivers through neighborhoods all across the county. Wallace, my old friend from the Department of Buildings, called to give me a heads up. This isn't going away quietly, Tom, he said. We're finding all kinds of stuff. Bogus contractor licenses, altered inspection forms, you name it. Can you make it stick? He hesitated. If you can get a few residents to testify that they were forced into unauthorized repairs or misled into signing work orders. We've got a case. I made some calls. Within days, we had testimonies. Ellie remembered being told she needed to install a new storm drain system at her expense or face escalating fines. But the HOA's inspector turned out to be Linda's brother-in-law with a fake badge and no license. Ed provided invoices where he was charged $300 for weed management assistance, which turned out to be nothing more than a teen with a weed whacker who never showed up. Even Maria had emails where Janice pressured her to replace her wooden fence with a vinyl one, citing neighborhood uniformity, only to discover that Janice's cousin owned the vinyl fence company and they'd inflated prices by 40%. It was corruption, plain and simple. And now the city had the receipts. But Janice didn't go quietly. Even though she'd resigned her influence, lingered. She still owned a house in the neighborhood, still had allies on the board who hadn't yet been voted out, still had money and connections. 2 days after the city audit was announced, I received a certified letter from her attorney. It accused me of personal defamation, professional interference, and intentional emotional distress. They demanded a retraction of all public statements and threatened a defamation lawsuit. Carla read the letter, chuckled, and tossed it in the shredder. "She's fishing," she said. "Let her. We've got the truth on our side." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was coming. That afternoon, I discovered my garage door keypad had been tampered with. The lock casing was scratched. My motion light had been turned toward the ground. It didn't feel random. Someone had tried to get in. I reported it. The police took it seriously, but there were no fingerprints, no footage, only fear. The next morning, I found my mailbox wide open with all its contents shredded on the ground. Carla sent a letter to Janice's legal team warning of a harassment injunction. Sandra published an op-ed titled, "From Power to Paranoia, Why Janice Langston Can't Let Go." The heat was getting to her. But she wasn't the only one under pressure. The city's next move was a public town hall. They wanted to hear from the residents, not just of Brookridge Summit, but other HOA neighborhoods that might be experiencing similar abuse. The auditorium was packed. Dozens of people stepped up to the mic to share their stories. A retired schoolteacher from Windmere Estates, a young family from Hillridge Grove, a couple who lost their home over a missed $78 HOA fine. We weren't just a neighborhood anymore. We were a movement. At the end of the night, Wallace stood before the crowd and made the announcement the city will begin drafting new regulations to restrict HOA control over essential utilities and emergency systems. Further, we are considering mandatory oversight committees for all HOA operations in this county. The crowd erupted. I looked at Ellie, who had tears in her eyes. Maria hugged her baby tighter. Ed simply nodded and muttered, "Damn right, we were being heard." But it wasn't until I got home that night that I realized what we'd truly done. My porch light was on. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could leave it there glowing proudly. There was a quiet peace in the air, a gentleness I hadn't felt in Brookridge Summit in a long time. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor's niece. "She's home. We're rebuilding. She asked me to send you this." Attached was a photo Eleanor in a wheelchair on a new porch wrapped in a quilt, smiling. And in her lap, a small handmade sign that read, "I still have light." I stared at it for a long time, long enough to let it soak through the armor I'd built around myself. Long enough to feel that maybe, just maybe, we were winning. You could feel the shift in Brookridge Summit like a current beneath your feet. The polite silence that had governed us for years, the hushed compliance, the muttered frustrations never said out loud, was gone. In its place came voices. Strong, steady, unafraid voices. People were speaking up, and the rest of the city was listening. The segment Sandra aired with Eleanor's photo and the caption, "I still have light," went viral. Over 500,000 views in 48 hours. She followed it with a longer exposé titled, "Powerless: How One Neighborhood Fought Back Against HOA Tyranny." It wasn't just local news anymore. Regional networks picked it up. National blogs. Even a morning talk show mentioned us in a segment about abusive homeowners associations. What surprised me most wasn't the attention, it was the flood of messages that came with it. My inbox overflowed. Strangers, veterans, single mothers, seniors, people from every corner of the country all saying the same thing. This happened to us, too. They cut off our water, and they locked us out of our community center during a hurricane. We were fined into foreclosure over a satellite dish. The pain was everywhere, and the fire that had nearly taken Eleanor had lit something much bigger, a national reckoning. One email stood out to me. It was from a woman in Arizona. Her HOA had shut off her AC during a 109-degree heat wave because she missed one quarterly payment, even though she was in the hospital with pneumonia. She wrote, "I survived, but my dog didn't. They said it wasn't their responsibility." I sat back in my chair and just wept. And then I got angry. Not just HOA angry, righteous angry. So I stood up and did something I hadn't done since my retirement celebration 5 years ago. I gave a speech, not in a suit, Not behind a podium, but in my front yard. I set up a folding table, hooked a mic into a little amp Ed loaned me, and told folks I'd be speaking Saturday at sunset. Didn't expect more than 15 people. Over 80 showed up. Lawn chairs spilled into the street, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, families who just moved in, even folks from other communities holding cardboard signs that read, HOAs shouldn't be bullies and utilities are rights, not privileges. I stepped up to the mic, the sun behind me. The street quiet, except for the chirping of evening birds and the occasional clink of a thermos or rustling bag of chips. Then I spoke. You all know who I am. I'm not a politician. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a neighbor. I mow my own lawn. I fix what breaks, and I believe that no one should ever be punished with silence, darkness, or fear for standing up to what's wrong. What happened to Eleanor shouldn't have happened. What happened to our block, the fear, the fines, the retaliation, should never be allowed in a country built on freedom. We were never meant to be ruled by unelected tyrants with clipboards. But here's what I've learned. They don't win because they're stronger. They win because we're afraid, because we don't talk, because we don't gather, because we think we're alone. Well, we're not alone, not anymore. Applause erupted. People stood, cheered. And in that moment, it was more than applause, it was affirmation. A new chapter had begun. The next day, Carla called with news. The judge approved our class action filing. I blinked. You're kidding. Nope. We're officially representing Brook Ridge Summit residents in a civil case against the former board for negligence, emotional distress, and financial harm. How many plaintiffs? 38 and counting. And it didn't stop there. Within the week, a state senator contacted me. He'd been forwarded the story by his assistant and was drafting a bill to reform how HOAs operate in Georgia, specifically their access to essential utilities enforcement procedures and transparency requirements. He asked if I would testify before the committee. I agreed without hesitation. Ellie came with me. So did Maria. So did Ed. We drove to Atlanta together, an oddball convoy of warriors in old clothes with worn briefcases and handwritten notes. We sat in front of a half circle of lawmakers and told our story. Not just about the fire, but about the years of subtle oppression, the fines, the humiliation, the fear of speaking out. Ellie's voice cracked when she spoke about her mother's oxygen tank. Ed stood straight and proud when he described his service to the country. And yet I felt more afraid of a newsletter than a battlefield, he said. That one got quoted in 4 newspapers. When it was my turn, I didn't look at the lawmakers. I looked at the camera, at the people who might be watching, the woman in Arizona, the man in Florida who'd written to me about being fined for hanging an American flag, the elderly couple in Ohio who said their HOA turned off their stair lift because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. And I said, this isn't about weeds or shutters or garbage cans. This is about dignity, about people being crushed under the boot of systems that were never meant to wield this kind of power. If this body does nothing else, let it be this return power to the people, where it belongs. They voted to advance the bill, unanimously. Back home, things started changing fast. With Carla's help, we restructured the Brook Ridge Summit HOA charter. We eliminated punitive fines. We established a rotating compliance committee made up of residents, not appointees. We created an emergency utilities bylaw that prevented any future blackout without city review. And the first order of business, under the new charter, we renamed the park behind the clubhouse. It had been called Langston Green. We held a vote, a simple one. It would now be called Matthew's Light after my little brother. Because sometimes the best way to honor pain is to transform it. We installed a new bench, solar lighting, a bronze plaque that reads, "For those who were silenced, may your light never go out again." The unveiling drew a crowd, bigger than I expected. Not just neighbors, people from all over the county, journalists, lawyers, kids running across the grass without fear. And at the very edge of the crowd, I saw Eleanor in a chair wrapped in that same quilt, her niece holding her hand. She looked at me and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." But the truth is, I should have thanked her, because her survival lit the fire that changed us all. The lawsuit moved faster than anyone expected. Carla was relentless. Her filings were sharp, airtight, and built like firewalls not even the slimiest of HOA attorneys could wiggle through. By the time we stepped into that courtroom for the first hearing, the momentum was already ours. We had 38 plaintiffs. We had signed affidavits. We had the internal emails. We had the press. And most importantly, we had the truth. Janice Langston, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view entirely. Her attorney tried to argue that she had resigned well before any damages occurred, as if stepping down from a role absolved you from the consequences of wielding that role like a weapon. The judge didn't buy it. Neither did the jury. Over the course of 4 days, we laid it all out, not just the fire, but the pattern of abusive enforcement, the predatory fines, the retaliatory policies, the personal relationships that profited from HOA contracts. Carla had subpoenaed invoices, emails, texts, and bank records. The rot was deep. Janice's cousin, who won over $200,000 in landscaping contracts, was shown to be using off-the-books day laborers and falsifying timesheets. One HOA officer had been pocketing inspection fees through a shell company registered to a P.O. box. But what hit the hardest wasn't the paperwork, it was the testimony. Maria's voice shook as she told the jury about her toddler crying in the cold, how she'd wrapped him in every towel in the house, when the power went out, unsure if he'd make it through the night. Ed stared straight ahead as he described being told he could lose his home over a tool shed. After I fought for this country, I had to fight for my lawnmower, Ellie Gentle. Ellie brought the courtroom to a standstill when she described sitting in the dark beside her mother, the battery on the oxygen unit, blinking red, praying someone would come and knowing that the people who should have helped were the ones who caused it. When it was my turn, I stood without notes. I looked at the jury, a cross-section of strangers, all of whom had likely lived under some form of HOA or community covenant, and said this: I buried my little brother because of a faulty smoke detector and no warning. I spent 30 years trying to make sure no family ever had to go through what mine did. When I moved into Brookridge Summit, I thought I was done fighting fires. But this fire wasn't about wiring or carelessness. This fire was about people playing God with something sacred, and they nearly killed someone to collect $130 in dues. The courtroom was silent. You could feel the weight of it land. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned with a verdict, liable on all counts. Damages awarded $2.3 million in compensatory damages, divided among the plaintiffs, $750,000. In punitive damages assessed directly to the former HOA leadership. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But the message was clear. You don't get to hurt people under the guise of order. You don't get to strip dignity in the name of policy. You don't get to call it community while operating like a cartel. The ruling sent ripples across the state. HOA boards from other neighborhoods began reaching out, asking for help, revising their charters, consulting Carla about compliance, attending our public forums. Sandra's next story was titled The Summit Effect, How One Neighborhood's Fight is Changing the Game. And Brookridge, we got busy rebuilding. One of the first things we did was launch a program called Neighbors First, a community service initiative funded by the damages we won. The idea was simple: no more weaponized enforcement. Instead of fines, we offered assistance. A neighbor's grass got too tall. We mowed it together. Someone fell behind on payments. We called, asked if they needed help, and found a way. We built ramps for the elderly. We started a free babysitting exchange. We set up a weekly dinner potluck in the clubhouse. It sounds small, maybe even naive. But I'll tell you something, no HOA meeting had ever seen the kind of turnout those dinners did. People came not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because they were part of something real. One evening, as we were setting out the folding tables, a teenage boy approached me. Gangly, awkward voice cracking like mine once had. "Mr. Granger," he said, "my dad told me what you did. He said you saved someone." I looked at him surprised. "I didn't do it alone," I said. "We all did." He nodded, then added, "I want to be a firefighter." I smiled. "Well," I said, "you'll be walking into a good legacy." Weeks turned to months. Spring rolled in, painting Brookridge in soft greens and flowering trees. The neighborhood looked the same, but it felt different, lighter, stronger, free. And then one day, Just as the air began to shift from crisp to warm, Eleanor returned. The rebuilt house was modest, identical in structure to the old one, but brighter somehow. Fresh paint, solar panels, a new porch swing. We gathered to welcome her home. She stood beside her niece, holding a cane, the quilt still draped over her shoulders. As I helped her up the steps, she looked out over the gathered crowd and said, "I always knew this street had good bones. I just didn't know it had this much heart." Someone cheered. Then everyone clapped. She turned to me and said, "You brought the light back, Tom." I shook my head. "No, ma'am," I replied. "You were the spark." Later that night, I sat alone on my porch with a mug of coffee and the evening breeze brushing my skin. The lights on the street flickered on one by one soft amber glows, dancing across tidy lawns and flower beds. But for the first time in a long while, those lights weren't just functional, they were symbolic. We had turned the tables, not through rage, not through revenge, but through resilience. We had taken something broken, something meant to control, and rebuilt it as something that served, that protected, that healed. And it all began with one fire, one voice, one choice to say enough. 6 months after the verdict, I walked Eleanor back through her front door. The rebuilt house still smelled faintly of fresh lumber and new paint. Her niece had added touches of the old decor, the birdcage clock, the crocheted curtains. Her collection of ceramic cardinals lined neatly along the windowsill, but everything else had been upgraded wider. Door frames, fire-rated drywall, a state-of-the-art smoke alarm system connected to a backup battery, and solar panel. She gripped my arm gently as she stepped inside. "Everything's so warm," she whispered. It was. But not just the heat. The house had a warmth to it that I couldn't put into words. A sense that something good had taken root here. That this wasn't just a return, it was a rebirth. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, eyes wet but glowing. I squeezed her hand. "You earned it." She chuckled, her voice still raspy from months of recovery. "We all did. We did." In the months following the trial, Brookridge Summit transformed not just on paper, not just in policy, but in spirit. Gone were the cold, patrolling board members and passive-aggressive emails. The power games, the arbitrary fines, the silencing of dissent, gone. In their place stood something rare, a real living community. We took things slowly, deliberately. Every change was voted on. Every voice counted. We hosted town circles instead of closed meetings. Every financial decision was published online, down to the dollar. When someone needed help, a busted water heater, an overgrown lawn, a sick child, a group text would go out. And someone always showed up. One evening, Ellie pulled me aside after a potluck. "You know, I used to think I'd leave this place," she said. "That once Mom passed, I'd pack up and go somewhere quieter, simpler." "And now?" I asked. She smiled. "Now it feels like home." Even Ed, who used to grumble about everything from weeds to weather, began keeping bees and built a shed labeled Community Honey Exchange. Maria started a garden collective. We turned the unused corner lot into rows of tomatoes, basil, kale, and sunflowers. People who'd never spoken more than a few words were now trading pickles and zucchini on Saturdays, arguing over compost like old friends. And then there was the library box. It was Ellie's idea, a little wooden cabinet on a post just outside Eleanor's rebuilt home, painted cardinal red, filled with books free to borrow. On the side, stenciled in white paint, it read, "What we build, we share." People left cookbooks, mysteries, poetry. One morning, I found a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird tucked between a biography of Abraham Lincoln and a children's picture book. Inside was a note that simply read, "For Eleanor, for Tom, for us." I kept that note. The state bill we testified for passed into law in early May. It was called the Homeowner Power Accountability Act. For the first time, HOAs in Georgia were legally prohibited from suspending electricity, water, or emergency systems without judicial oversight. Every HOA board now required third-party audits annually, and fines had to be approved by an independent mediator before being enforced. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it started on our little street. 1 week later, the governor invited me and Carla to the signing ceremony. She went in a sharp gray blazer. I went in my uniform, not my fire marshal's dress, blues, but a worn denim jacket with my station's old patch sewn on the sleeve. I brought Eleanor's picture with me, and Matthew's. I didn't need to say anything, just held them in my hands while the ink dried. We returned to Brookridge that evening to find the whole block lined with paper lanterns, each one painted by the kids glowing soft gold in the breeze. Some had names on them: Matthew, Eleanor, Grace, Ed. Some just had heart stars or little flames. Someone had left a sign on my lawn: "The fire tried to destroy us, but it only lit the way." By fall, I'd decided to step down as HOA president, not out of exhaustion, but because it was time. I'd done what I came to do, built the scaffolding. Now it was someone else's turn to keep building, to protect what we'd created. I handed the reins to Ellie. She protested at first, but when she took the oath under the sunset glow of the newly renamed Matthews Light Park, I knew we'd chosen right. I promised, she said, to never forget who this is really for, and she hasn't. Under her leadership, we added mental health resources for residents, set up youth mentorships, converted the old HOA clubhouse into a community center complete with a first aid station generator and storm supplies. She even got us into the State Safe Neighborhoods program, a partnership with local fire departments to do annual safety inspections, voluntary, of course. I helped with the training. Funny how full circle life can be. As for me, I spend most days tending my garden, fixing small engines for neighbors, or walking Eleanor's little dog while she shouts after us from the porch. I mentor kids at the local high school now, mostly ones who want to be firefighters, or lawyers, or just better neighbors. And every evening, just as the sun drops behind the trees and the lights start coming on one by one across the block, I sit on my porch, coffee in a hand, and watch them glow. Not out of fear, not under threat, but freely, proudly, warmly. Because now we know what it's like to be without them. We know what it's like to have light stolen, and what it takes to win it back. Justice doesn't always arrive in flashing red lights or dramatic courtroom speeches. Sometimes it comes quietly, patiently, steadily, like the way a burned lawn finds green again. Like the way a broken house becomes a home. Like the way a neighborhood finally remembers what the word community was always meant to mean. We still have our scars, but we wear them like armor, proof that we made it through the fire, that we rebuilt together. And no matter what happens, no matter who tries to take it again, we'll be ready. Because this place, it belongs to us now, and we will never be powerless again.